You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Today's episode is sponsored by Acorns. As we wrap up 2024 and head into a new year, we naturally start to think about making New Year's resolutions, like going to the gym. We all start out with big goals, but did you know that only 8% of people will stick with their resolutions all year long? But what if you could make your resolutions automatic? Well, Acorns can't help you get to the gym, but they make it easy to start automatically saving and investing so your money has a chance to grow for you, your kids, and your retirement. You don't need to be an expert. Acorns will recommend a diversified portfolio that fits you and your money goals. And you don't need to be rich. Acorns lets you invest with the spare money you've got right now. You can start with $5 or even just your spare change. And you don't need a ton of time, unlike going to the gym. You can create your Acorns account and start investing in just 5 minutes. Head to acorns.com/CW or download the Acorns app to start saving and investing for your future today. Paid non-client endorsement. Compensation provides incentive to positively promote Acorns. Tier 1 compensation provided. Investing involves risk. Acorns Advisors LLC is an SEC-registered investment advisor. View important disclosures at acorns.com/CW.
As the federal advance began on May 4th, Lieutenant Colonel Theodore Lyman, an officer on George Meade's staff, watched at Germanna Ford as men from 5th and 6th Corps crossed the Rapidan River.
How strange it would be, he wrote in his diary, if each man who was destined to fall in the campaign ahead had some large badge on. If Lyman's wonder had been reality, the imposing sight of a great army on the move would have assumed the appearance of a funeral procession, since almost half the men he saw would have been so marked.
11 terrible days after the first federal soldiers crossed the Rapidan, Theodore Lyman would note wearily in his diary that he felt as though 6 months had passed.
Hey everyone, welcome to the 480th episode of our Civil War podcast. I'm Rich.
And I'm Tracy. Hello, y'all. Thanks for tuning into the podcast.
As you guys will recall, with the last episode, we set the stage for the start of the spring 1864 campaigning season in Virginia. And by mid-April, there were many signs that the Army of the Potomac was about to put the ball into play.
Reports reached Robert E. Lee that by mid-April, the settlers, that is, the merchants who supplied soldiers with pies, stationery, and other goods, had been ejected from the federal encampments. Also, civilian passes were impossible to come by, and the flow of such visitors had stopped.
The number of trains arriving at the Army of the Potomac's principal depot at Brandy Station had increased, as did the hustle and bustle amongst the various infantry and cavalry brigades. Lee's spies and scouts kept him continuously apprised of the activity across the Rapidan, and by April 28th, he let Jefferson Davis know that the Yankees had apparently completed their preparations. In fact, Lee seemed slightly surprised that the enemy was not yet on the move.
But one thing was certain, the Federals were about to launch an offensive, and so Lee needed every man he could get to meet it. Longstreet and his two wayward divisions had recently returned to the Army of Northern Virginia after their adventures at Chattanooga and Knoxville, but Old Pete's 3rd Division, George Pickett's, had not.
Nor had the brigades of Robert Hoke and R.D. Johnston. FYI, Johnston's brigade was Alfred Iverson's former command. Some of you may recall that Iverson's brigade had been roughly handled by the Federals on the first day at Gettysburg and suffered appalling losses, and the ensuing controversy saw Iverson banished from the Army of Northern Virginia. Well, in any case, Lee had pestered the War Department for weeks, requesting Hoke and Johnston's return, but to no avail. Richmond insisted that Pickett and Hoke were needed in North Carolina, while Johnston's brigade was covering a key railroad connection at Hanover Junction. On the eve of the campaign, Lee continued to fuss about these missing troops. Of course, it was a key part of Grant's plan that simultaneous federal activity on different fronts would prevent any reinforcements from being sent to Lee.
Shortly after midnight on Wednesday, May 4th, the Army of the Potomac's infantry divisions filed onto the roads that slanted down to the Rapidan River. Meanwhile, Sheridan's cavalry drove the Confederate pickets away from the crossing points.
After the Federal horsemen cleared the way, next came the Army's engineers, who manhandled 5 pontoon bridges into position, then stepped aside for the infantry divisions to cross the river.
Around 6 a.m., the lead units of Warren's 5th Corps appeared at Germanna Ford, uppermost of the 3 crossing points, followed by Sedgwick's 6th Corps.
2nd Corps, under Hancock, crossed 4 miles downstream at Ely's Ford, while a massive wagon train, over 3,400 wagons and almost 600 ambulances, drawn by more than 24,000 mules and horses, forded the Rapidan at an intervening crossing called Culpeper Mine Ford. Behind the wagons trailed a herd of cattle to be slaughtered as needed to provide the soldiers with fresh meat.
By launching the movement at night, George Meade hoped to get a few hours' head start on Lee, but the Confederates maintained a signal station on Clark Mountain, 10 miles south of Culpeper, and in the pre-dawn darkness, the rebel signalmen spotted the enemy activity at the crossing points.
At first, it was impossible to tell if the Federals were headed toward the left or right flank of Lee's army, but after sunrise, the signalmen could report, quote, "From present indications, everything seems to be moving to the right on Germanna Ford and Ely's Ford roads, leaving cavalry in our front."
Lee put his army on the road promptly. He had already alerted Ewell to be ready to move at daybreak. Now he instructed Ewell to leave a small rear guard and hustle the rest of his corps eastward along the Orange Turnpike, a macadamized road that led from Orange Courthouse to Fredericksburg, passing through the wilderness.
Similarly, Lee ordered A.P. Hill to march with 2 divisions east along the Orange Plank Road, which paralleled the turnpike a mile or so to the south, leaving Hill's 3rd Division to watch the Rapidan fords north of Orange Courthouse. Lee himself rode at the head of Hill's column.
Lee also sent word to Longstreet. Initially, he instructed Old Pete to fall in behind Hill's corps as it marched toward the wilderness, but Longstreet argued that it would be better to have his 2 divisions take a more southerly route.
True, Longstreet said, it would require a trek down narrow back roads, but it would also cut the distance to the battlefield and minimize traffic congestion. Well, Lee trusted Longstreet's judgment and approved his suggestion. And so, by early afternoon, the entire Confederate Army was in motion, marching to confront the Yankees along 3 parallel routes: Ewell on the Turnpike, Hill on the Plank Road, and Longstreet by a succession of back roads farther south.
Meanwhile, Jeb Stuart's cavalry trotted up the major roads and small country lanes, converging on the Federals from east, south, and west. Stuart's mission was less to delay the enemy than to gain information about his dispositions.
However, the Federal cavalry, for its part, effectively screened the Army of the Potomac's advance and kept the Confederate insights to a minimum. Somewhat surprisingly, Sheridan made little corresponding effort to find out what Lee's army was up to.
All in all, during the early part of the day on May 4th, neither side had much idea of the other's location or intentions. Lee knew for sure that those people, as he habitually called the soldiers of the United States, had crossed the Rapidan at Germanna and Ely's fords, but he did not yet know where they were heading.
Certainly they couldn't head straight for Richmond, because a march of more than 10 miles in that direction would expose their line of communication and supply to ruinous interdiction. So, more likely, the Federals would either turn east toward Fredericksburg to establish a new supply line, or else they would swing west to establish contact with the rebel army as quickly as possible.
Lee, in turn, had three possible responses. The first two were defensive in nature. He could return to the formidable Mine Run line, which would be a good place to fight Meade if he came west.
Or Lee could fall back to the North Anna River, which offered an advantageous position for the rebels if Meade changed his base to Fredericksburg. But both those courses of action yielded the initiative to the Yankees, and that was something Lee was always reluctant to do.
He therefore selected an aggressive response. To be precise, Lee would try to strike the Army of the Potomac while it was still in the wilderness.
Lee understood the Federals' numerical superiority would, to a large degree, be nullified by the tangled, difficult nature of the terrain in the wilderness and the region's limited road network. And so, if the enemy made a mistake while stuck in the wilderness, then Lee would seek to exploit it to his advantage. Accordingly, he intended to get his infantry within easy striking distance of the Federals, then attack if the opportunity arose, or adopt a defensive stance if the situation required it.
Aggressiveness was one thing, but recklessness quite another, and Lee knew that until all three of his corps arrived on the scene, it would be unwise to bring on a battle. He therefore instructed Ewell and Hill to advance until they were in contact with the enemy, but not to press the issue.
Lee's preliminary objective was twofold. One, to disrupt the Federals' timetable so they found themselves caught up in the wilderness, and then two, if possible, discover an opening for the Army of Northern Virginia to make an attack, but the attack itself would have to wait until Longstreet's arrival on the scene.
"20 miles away at Germanna Ford, George Meade and Ulysses S. Grant watched the men of Uncle John Sedgwick's 6th Corps follow Warren's 5th Corps across the Rapidan.
Meade and Grant each had his own perspective on the situation. In Meade's view, Lee's most likely responses were to stand at Mine Run or fall back to the North Anna. If Lee indeed chose to once again occupy the Mine Run line, then the planned flanking movement by Hancock's 2nd Corps offered the best chance of defeating him. However, if Lee headed toward the North Anna, the Federal plan could be readily modified to address that development.
George Meade gave little consideration to the possibility that Lee would come east of Mine Run, probably because he considered it the weakest of Lee's options, since if Lee did advance east of Mine Run, he would be forsaking a strong defensive position in order to confront the Army of the Potomac on uncertain terms.
And Meade knew firsthand the power of the defense. At Antietam, his division had formed part of a corps-level attack that had done little more than dent the rebel line at awful cost. At Fredericksburg, his division had broken through the Confederate line briefly, but then was compelled to retreat for lack of support. As an army commander, he had won his victory at Gettysburg by wisely remaining on the defensive. Thus, the thing Meade feared most in the coming campaign was the prospect of attacking the rebels on ground that Lee had chosen.
However, Ulysses S. Grant had just the opposite instinct. Each of his bad moments thus far in the war had come on the defensive, as at Shiloh, or when difficult terrain made it hard for him to close with the enemy, as during the frustrating early months of the Vicksburg campaign.
But on the offensive, Grant had never suffered a serious reverse. Attacks at Fort Donelson, Port Gibson, Champion Hill, and Chattanooga had all succeeded. Even the failed May assaults on Vicksburg had merely been introductory chapters in the saga of his greatest victory. In any case, now with the present campaign and the battles to come, the differing mindsets of Grant and Meade would make them a mismatched pair and would have consequences more than once.
The Home Depot has up to 35% off select appliances like Samsung, ranked #1 in customer satisfaction. Shop the mega capacity 3-door French door refrigerator with 4 types of ice to chill your drink faster. Or the 5-burner electric range with no preheat air fry for healthier, crispy food all in your oven. Right now, get up to 35% off select appliances at the Home Depot. How doers get more done. Visit jdpower.com/awards for more details. Pricing valid January 9th through January 29th. U.S. only. See store online for details.
All day on May 4th, the two armies marched, each certain that a collision was imminent, but equally aware that a pitched battle that day was unlikely.
By mid-afternoon, Meade halted his infantry squarely in the middle of the wilderness. He wanted to give his massive supply train time to catch up, and besides, his men had been marching for 15 hours, so they needed a rest.
5th and 6th Corps halted between Germanna Ford and a forlorn place called Wilderness Tavern, where the Orange Turnpike and Germanna Plank Road converged.
2nd Corps bivouacked 3 miles east of Chancellorsville, where the rival armies had clashed almost exactly 1 year earlier. Disturbingly, Hancock's soldiers found numerous bleached skeletons in the surrounding fields and woods. On the Confederate side, Dick Ewell and A.P. Hill reached their assigned stopping points around dusk. Ewell at Locust Grove, just east of Mine Run, and Hill at a little community called New Verdiersville. Ewell and Hill were within 4 miles of the Federals, but Lee was still missing a third of his infantry. Major General Richard Anderson's division of Hill's Corps remained near Clark Mountain, guarding the Rapidan fords in that area in case the Yankees made a movement against Lee's left rear. And Longstreet, who didn't set out until 4 o'clock that afternoon, was still some 20 miles away at Brock's Bridge on the North Anna headwaters. That evening, Robert E. Lee set up his headquarters in a grove of trees beside a New Verdiersville residence and waited for intelligence reports. The first to arrive was from Stuart's cavalry, and it was disappointing since it gave no clear indication of what the Yankees' intentions might be. The Federals might be turning west to engage the Army of Northern Virginia, but with equal plausibility, they might be headed east on the way to Fredericksburg. In the absence of firm information about the enemy's intentions, Lee opted to be aggressive. At 8 p.m. on the night of the 4th, his adjutant, Lieutenant Colonel Walter Taylor, wrote Ewell of Lee's plans. Quote, "He wishes you to be ready to move on early in the morning. If the enemy moves down the river, that is toward Fredericksburg, He wishes you to push on after him. If he comes this way, we will take our old line, that is, at Mine Run." And Taylor concluded, "The general's desire is to bring the enemy to battle as soon now as possible."
That evening, Lee received a message from Jefferson Davis telling Lee not to expect the return anytime soon of the units on detached duty, including Pickett's division. Davis said Pickett was being held back in anticipation of a movement by Butler's troops on the peninsula, or Pickett might be sent to North Carolina to take part in an effort to recapture the coastal town of New Bern.
Lee's frustration with Richmond's reluctance to return his troops to him was evident in his response to Jefferson Davis. Lee had already wired Davis that Meade had crossed the Rapidan. Now he told Davis that the Federals were marching, but, quote, "whether with the intention of attacking or moving toward Fredericksburg, I am not able to say. But it is apparent that the long-threatened effort to take Richmond has begun, and that the enemy has collected all his available force to accomplish it."
Lee continued, quote, "Under these circumstances, I regret that there is to be a further delay in concentrating our own troops," end quote. And while Lee appreciated there were benefits attached to retaking New Bern, quote, "they will not compensate us for disaster in Virginia or Georgia."
You see, Lee believed the best course of action lay in focusing on defeating the enemy's main armies. Do that, Lee argued, and the places presently occupied by the Yankees, like New Bern, could more easily be recovered, if indeed the enemy didn't give up such places of his own accord. Well, Lee threw in the usual disclaimers about Davis having superior information and wisdom, but his central point was clear. Quote, "It seems to me that the great efforts of the enemy here and in Georgia have begun, and that the necessity of our concentration at both points is immediate and imperative."
As the night went on, further intelligence arrived at Lee's headquarters, most of it more helpful than the ambiguous early reports. Scouts from the cavalry division of Robert E. Lee's nephew, Major General Fitzhugh Lee, had infiltrated to Chancellorsville and discovered that the Federal infantry was turning west toward Orange Courthouse, not east toward Fredericksburg.
Jeb Stuart passed along that information, which likely reached Army headquarters after midnight, so Lee probably learned of it only at 3 a.m., the time he customarily awakened while on campaign. But whenever he learned of the report, it surely increased his confidence in the course of action he had decided to pursue. The Federals were deep in the wilderness, and so at a disadvantage. Lee believed Grant had made a mistake, and now Lee would make him pay for it.
Lee would pin the Yankees in the wilderness with Ewell and Hill, then strike them hard when Longstreet came up. As the light of the new day lit up the landscape on the morning of Thursday, May 5th, staff officers noted that Robert E. Lee seemed to be in particularly good spirits.
The men of Ewell's corps were up at dawn on May 5th as well, and by 5 a.m. they were swinging along down the Orange Turnpike. Dick Ewell was feeling just as pleased with events as Robert E. Lee. When asked about Lee's orders, Ewell cheerfully replied they were, quote, "just the orders I like. Go right down the turnpike and strike the enemy wherever I find him."
Ewell found the Federals just 3 miles east. To be precise, his skirmishers did, and a brief popping erupted as they traded shots with the enemy picket line. Ewell dispatched an aide to tell Lee that he had made contact with the Yankee pickets and he intended to push ahead until he found the enemy in force.
"Not so fast," Lee told the aide. A.P. Hill was lagging behind a bit, and Longstreet was still miles away. If he wished, General Ewell was free to send forward a strong skirmish line to develop the situation and ascertain the enemy's strength, but he was not to get his troops, quote, entangled so as to be unable to disengage them in case the enemy were in force, end quote. In other words, Robert E. Lee didn't want Dick Ewell to barrel ahead on his own and upset Lee's plans.
The aide galloped back and discovered that in the meantime, Ewell had deployed his lead division under Major General Edward Allegheny Johnson at the western edge of a large uncultivated field.
Called Saunders Field after the farm family who owned it, it straddled the turnpike and was one of the few large clearings in this part of the wilderness. It was a good rifle shot from one end to the other, and so it gave Allegheny Johnson's troops an excellent field of fire. When the aide passed along Robert E. Lee's instructions, Ewell told Johnson to assume a defensive posture, then ordered his remaining divisions to come up as well.
Major General Robert Rhodes's division extended Johnson's line to the south, below the turnpike, while Ewell held Major General Jubal Early's division in reserve. Allegheny Johnson's men and Rhodes's troops, as soon as they came up, immediately began to throw up breastworks to protect themselves.
The use of such field fortifications was not new, of course, but for the first 2 years of the war, field works had been used almost exclusively to defend fixed points, such as with Robert E. Lee's use of entrenchments in June 1862 to hold Richmond with a reduced force, while he marched off with most of the army to hit McClellan and begin what came to be known as the 7 Days Battles. In any case, only gradually did Civil War armies develop the habit of erecting field fortifications for the express purpose of protecting troops on active campaign.
Lee had ordered his army to entrench after Fredericksburg and during the early stages of the Chancellorsville campaign. The Federals did so on parts of the Chancellorsville and Gettysburg battlefields. And then, during the autumn maneuvering in 1863, while Longstreet was off in Tennessee, Lee made extensive use of field works to protect the reduced force at his disposal, especially at Mine Run.
Such entrenchments typically began with the digging of rifle pits, with some men wielding picks and shovels if available, or bayonets, tin cups, and mess pans if not. Meanwhile, other soldiers collected fence rails and stones, and, time permitting, some would topple trees with axes. Post-war photographs of Ewell's breastworks at the edge of Saunders Field show rifle pits, or entrenchments, about 2 feet deep, covered in front by a parapet of logs some 5 feet high. The logs were neatly laid one on top of the other, chinked with mud, and reinforced at intervals by traverses, that is, a wall, so to speak, constructed perpendicular to the main work, whose purpose was to cut down the possibility of enfilade fire if the enemy made a breakthrough at some point.
Although not unknown before this campaign, the construction of such fieldworks would become one of its defining characteristics. The same will be true of Sherman's campaign in Georgia.
In Virginia and Georgia, troops on both sides will immediately begin to throw up fieldworks at every opportunity. Fighting largely on the defensive, the Confederates will receive the greatest benefit from these works, and within 2 weeks, Theodore Lyman, who would be writing to his parents, would tell them about how quickly the rebels could erect them. Quote, "Within 1 hour, there is a shelter against bullets, high enough to cover a man kneeling. It is a rule that when the rebels halt, the first day gives them a good rifle pit, the second, an infantry parapet with artillery in position, and the third, a parapet in front and entrenched batteries behind. Sometimes they put this 3 days' work into the first 24 hours.
As Ewell's troops began the work of building those fieldworks on May 5th, word of the Confederate presence flew up the federal chain of command to Meade, who, with his staff, had just reached Wilderness Tavern.
The first dispatch implied the rebels weren't present in force. Succeeding reports gave much the same impression. As a result, Meade canceled the day's scheduled marches and instead issued orders for an attack. Apparently, he reasoned that if Lee, for some reason, had advanced a part of his army east of the Mine Run line, then it would be a good idea for the Federals to seize the chance to strike that portion of the rebel army and punish it.
Grant agreed. After all, the whole purpose of the campaign was the destruction of Lee's army, and if the opportunity came up to pitch into a part of it, then Meade should do so immediately.
And that's where we'll leave things for this episode. If we start in with what all happens next on May 5th, this show will end up being twice as long as this, and that'd be a bit excessive. So we're going to hit the pause button here.
As we teased with the Theodore Lyman quote at the top of the show, and as many of you already know, the operations that have been collectively called the Wilderness Campaign and the Overland Campaign in Virginia in the spring of 1864 were a test of wills and skill between Grant and Lee and turned into a brutal 40-day stretch of nearly continuous maneuvering and fighting between the Army of the Potomac and the Army of Northern Virginia.
And so we're going to take our time with the story of the Wilderness Campaign / Overland Campaign, since it's not only fascinating in its own right, but it'll also lead us to Petersburg and eventually to the surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia at Appomattox. Anyway, we're so glad that you're along with us as we start off on this journey that will carry us through the killing ground, from the wilderness to Spotsylvania Courthouse to the North Anna River and to Cold Harbor. We're looking forward to it and hope you are too.
That means it's time for this episode's book recommendation. And our recommendation this time is The Battle of the Wilderness, May 5th and 6th, 1864, by Gordon C. Ray.
Gordon Ray has written a series of excellent books about the wilderness and overland campaigns, all of which we'll end up recommending before we're done. But the first is this one, The Battle of the Wilderness, May 5th and 6th, 1864.
You can find a complete list of all of our book recommendations if you head over to the podcast website, which is www.civilwarpodcast.org.
Also at the website, you can find info about joining the Strawfoot Brigade over on Patreon and supporting the podcast in that way, just like Dave S. and Michael A. did this past week. Thanks, guys.
We also want to give a shout out to Samuel C. for his donation. Then, thanks to all of you for listening to this episode of the podcast. Rich and I do hope that you'll join us again next time, but until then, take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.